He was the ghost that haunted Ethelgard's, the storm every server prayed would pass them by. Julian Croft, a titan of private equity whose net worth was eclipsed only by the Arctic vastness of his displeasure. His name was a four-letter word whispered in the polished chrome of the kitchen, a name that could curdle hollandaise from 10 paces. The seasoned staff of Ethelgard's, a bastion of old-world dining in the heart of Chicago, had developed a sophisticated avoidance ballet. A sudden migraine, a phantom spill in the wine cellar, an urgent need to repolish already gleaming silverware. Any excuse would do to escape the gravitational pull of Table 12. For years, they had navigated the minefield of his presence, adhering to a set of unwritten, life-preserving commandments. Never presume, never interject, never under any circumstances meet his gaze for longer than a single, deferential second. Then Alara Vance, 22 and carrying the weight of a dying legacy on her slender shoulders, tied on her starched white apron for the first time. She was oblivious to the restaurant's resident phantom, a lamb walking into a lion's den that the other sheep had long since learned to map. And when she looked the lion dead in the eye, not with defiance, but with a quiet, unnerving curiosity, she didn't just light a fuse. She struck a match in a room filled with historical dynamite, preparing to expose a betrayal so deep it had reshaped the city's skyline, and a secret that lay buried beneath the very foundations of Ethelgard's itself. Ethelgard's wasn't merely a place to eat, it was a living museum. Its mahogany-paneled walls had absorbed the cigar smoke of stock market tycoons and the hushed promises of political kingmakers for over a century. Its patrons were a curated collection of Chicago's elite, old money families who traced their lineage back to the Great Fire, tech billionaires in bespoke sneakers, and the legal sharks who swam in their wakes. The staff were meant to be as timeless and unobtrusive as the decor. Specters in tuxedos who materialized with a perfectly chilled martini before the desire for one had fully formed in a diner's mind. But on Thursday nights, this carefully orchestrated symphony of civility was thrown into chaos by a one-man show of psychological warfare, with Julian Croft as its sole writer, director, and star. Thursday was his night. The name Julian Croft was a legend whispered among the city's financial elite. He was the vulture of LaSalle Street, a man who had built a Leviathan private equity firm, Croft Holdings, by identifying venerable but struggling companies, dismembering them, and selling the pieces for a colossal profit. His face, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, framed by hair the color of brushed steel, was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. But within the hallowed, carpeted halls of Ethelgard's, he wasn't a vulture. He was a black hole, consuming all light and warmth around him. The stories were the restaurant's own chilling folklore. There was the sommelier, a man with a palate so refined he could tell you the weather on the day the grapes were picked, who was dismissed on the spot for recommending a Bordeaux that Croft deemed tragically optimistic. There was the young busboy who, in a moment of nervous haste, had set a water glass down with a barely audible clink, only to be met with a stare so glacial he'd reportedly walked out mid-shift and never returned. The fear was palpable. When his obsidian Bentley, a silent, predatory shark of a car, would whisper to the curb, a wave of systemic panic would ripple through the restaurant. Jean-Pierre, the unflappable maître d'hôtel who had once calmly seated a shake next to his mortal enemy without incident, would find his smile tightening at the edges. Veteran waiters would suddenly recall urgent matters in the subterranean stockrooms. The unenviable task of serving him was decided by a grim, unspoken lottery of who had had the least disastrous week. Into this theater of carefully managed terror walked Alara Vance. She was new, not just to Ethelgard's, but to this entire stratosphere of existence. She was a girl of books and history, with eyes the color of aged paper that held a scholar's focus. Her life had been a quiet battle fought amongst dusty shelves and the scent of decaying glue. She was the sole proprietor and caretaker of Vance and Son Booksellers, a small, crumbling institution her great-grandfather had founded, and the last remaining fragment of her family's legacy. She was also 3 months from foreclosure. The bookstore was her heart, her history, her home. but history doesn't pay the property taxes. Ethelgard's, with its promise of substantial tips, was a desperate last-ditch effort to save it. For Ilara, this job wasn't a career. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning dream. She'd spent her first week in a whirlwind of learning, memorizing not just the sprawling menu, but the subtle lineage of the restaurant's regulars, the unspoken hierarchy of the dining room. Her training, conducted by the perpetually stressed floor manager, Mr. Peterson, had covered every conceivable service scenario except for the existential threat of Julian Croft. On her second Thursday, the metaphorical short straw was thrust upon her. The waiter who usually drew the Croft assignment, a hardened veteran named Marcus, had come down with a case of food poisoning so sudden and severe that no one even bothered to question its diplomatic nature. Mr. Peterson, his face a tight mask of anxiety, scanned the floor. His gaze, laced with desperation, landed on Ilara. She was meticulously arranging the dessert forks at a side station, her movements precise and economical. "Vance," Peterson's voice was a low, urgent hiss. "You're on table 12. "Of course, Mr. Peterson," she replied, her focus not wavering. "Is there anything I should know? Any dietary restrictions?" A strangled snort escaped a nearby waiter, which he quickly disguised as a cough under Peterson's withering glare. "Just—" Peterson leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Be invisible. Be perfect. Do not speak unless you are directly addressed. Do not offer opinions. Do not, and I cannot stress this enough, make sustained eye contact. You are a function, not a person. You deliver, you retrieve, you disappear. Got it?" The sheer intensity of the warning was bizarre, but Ilara simply nodded. She dealt with cantankerous academics fighting over the last copy of a rare manuscript. How much worse could one wealthy diner be? Straightening her apron, she took a steadying breath and picked up a heavy, leather-bound menu. As she approached table 12, a secluded corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the glittering Chicago skyline, she felt the very atmosphere of the room change. The low hum of conversation seemed to dip in frequency. The other servers moved with a new stilted deliberateness, their movements carefully choreographed to keep them as far from her trajectory as possible. She could feel their collective apprehension on her back, a heavy, suffocating cloak. He was already seated, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window. He didn't acknowledge her approach. He was a man carved from granite, his bespoke charcoal suit doing little to soften the imposing breadth of his shoulders. A glass of amber liquid, likely whiskey, sat untouched by his right hand. "Good evening, sir," Ilara said, her voice clear and even. "Welcome to Ethelgard's. May I present you with the menu?" Julian Croft turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes, a startling Arctic blue, performed a clinical scan of her, from the sensible black shoes on her feet to the tightly pinned bun of her brown hair. It wasn't a leer. It was an assessment, cold and impersonal, as if he were inspecting a piece of equipment for defects. He remained silent. The silence stretched, thick and cloying. Ilara held his gaze, her instincts battling Peterson's frantic warnings. In the world of rare books, looking away from a serious collector was a sign of weakness, an admission that you didn't know your own stock. Cowering felt alien to her. It felt like a lie. Finally, with a soft, dismissive wave of his hand, he gestured to the table. "Leave it." Ilara placed the menu down. "Can I bring you another whiskey while you consider the menu?" He picked up the glass, studying it as if he'd never seen it before. He didn't drink. "You're new," he stated. It was a declaration of fact, not a question. "Yes, sir, this is my second week. Ethelgard's is entrusting its most discerning clientele to apprentices now," he mused, the disdain in his tone as sharp and cold as an icicle. How far the mighty have fallen. A spark of indignation flared in Ilara's chest, but she smothered it. She thought of the final notice from the bank, the way her grandfather's hands trembled when he talked about losing the store. She could not afford the luxury of pride. "I've studied the restaurant's history extensively, sir," she replied, her tone remaining impeccably professional. "And I can assure you, the only thing that has fallen is the decibel level, now that a gentleman of your stature has graced us with his presence." The silence that descended upon the alcove was absolute, a vacuum, Ilara's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. Fired in her second week. Across the room, she could feel Mr. Peterson's psychic scream of horror. She saw Brenda, a veteran waitress, bring a hand to her mouth in a gesture of pure shock. Croft's severe expression did not change, but something flickered in the depths of those glacial eyes. Not surprise, not annoyance, but a flicker of analysis. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment, then let out a low, non-committal grunt. The dry-aged ribeye, Pittsburgh rare. If I see a trace of color past the outer char, it goes back. The béarnaise sauce is to be served on the side, at room temperature. Not chilled, not warm, room temperature, and a bottle of the 96 Screaming Eagle. He didn't glance at the wine list. It was one of the most absurdly expensive vintages they possessed. It was a test, a flagrant display of power. An excellent, if bold, choice to pair with the ribeye, sir, Ilara said, her voice betraying none of the chaos in her mind. She made a note on her pad. I will inform the chef of your precise instructions. She turned and walked away, her posture erect, her steps unhurried. She did not look back. She projected an aura of calm competence she was a million miles from feeling. As she passed the service station, Brenda grabbed her arm, her eyes wide with a cocktail of terror and disbelief. Are you out of your mind? Brenda hissed. You corrected him. You complimented his insult. I didn't correct him, Ilara said quietly, gently pulling her arm free. I did my job. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to explain the quantum state of room temperature to Chef Dubois. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, leaving a wake of stunned disbelief. The staff of Ethelgard's had just witnessed heresy. A novice had not only looked the dragon in the eye, she had engaged it in conversation. The script that had governed their lives for years had just been set on fire, and for the first time, no one had any idea what would happen in the third act. The kitchen, usually a symphony of controlled chaos, fell silent as Ilara entered. Chef Dubois, a volatile Frenchman whose temper was as legendary as his sauces, looked up from a delicate arrangement of scallops. He feared no critic, no owner, no health inspector. But the specter of Julian Croft seemed to haunt even his stainless steel domain. The order for table 12, Ilara announced, handing him the slip. She leaned in, lowering her voice. Chef, he was specific. Pittsburgh rare, but he said he wants no color past the char. And the béarnaise? Room temperature. Dubois snatched the docket, his magnificent mustache twitching. No color past the char? Does he want me to burn the outside and serve the inside raw? Is he a man or a panther? And room temperature. Whose room? This kitchen is 100 degrees. The dining room is 72. It is madness. I believe it's a test, Chef, Ilara said, her voice calm and steady. He's testing the limits of the system. Of us. Dubois grumbled, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow at the back of his hand. This man. Every week, a new philosophical insult. Fine. I will sear it with the fires of hell for 40 seconds aside. I will leave the béarnaise on the pass for precisely 7 minutes. If he complains, you tell him it was calibrated by a Swiss watchmaker. He then bellowed at a sous chef. Get the 96 Eagle from the deep vault. Handle it as if it were the last bottle on earth, you clumsy oaf. Ilara retreated from the kitchen's heat, but the dining room offered no relief. She had become the focal point of 100 whispered conversations. She was no longer the new girl. She was a case study in professional suicide, a curiosity to be observed from a safe distance. Mr. Peterson intercepted her by the maitre d's stand, pulling her into the narrow coat check closet. His face was pale, his tie slightly askew. Vance, in the name of all that is holy, what was that? He demanded, his voice a strained whisper. The decibel level? Are you actively trying to get us all fired? Are you trying to get me fired? He was baiting me, Mr. Peterson, Ilara said, her own defensiveness rising. He was insulting the restaurant's standards. My standards. I refused to take the bait. You don't understand, Peterson said, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off a migraine. This isn't about standards. It's about survival. Let me tell you about a waiter named David, 2 years ago. Good kid. Croft claimed his consommé was tepid. David, trying to be helpful, said, I can assure you, sir, it's fresh from the pot. A simple sentence. Peterson looked Alara dead in the eye, his gaze heavy with warning. Croft made a single phone call. The next day, David's brother, an architect at a major firm, was pulled from a multi-million-dollar project he'd been leading for a year. The firm had just been acquired in a hostile takeover by a subsidiary of Croft Holdings. We never proved the connection, but we all knew. The man doesn't just get angry, he gets biblical. He ruins lives over soup, Vance. Do you understand? A cold dread, far more chilling than the earlier adrenaline, washed over Alara. This wasn't just a rude, powerful man. This was something else entirely. Malignant. But why? Alara asked, her voice barely audible. Why is he like that? Peterson let out a long, weary sigh. The rumors. They say he wasn't always this way. 15 years ago, he was a different man. A builder, not a destroyer. His firm, Croft & Thorne, specialized in urban renewal, restoring historic buildings. He had a wife, a family. Then, his partner, Marcus Thorne, staged a coup. A brutal, brilliant boardroom maneuver. Thorne, with the backing of the other partners, accused Croft of mismanagement, pushed him out, and took everything. The company, the reputation, even the family name on the door. They say the betrayal broke something inside him. His wife left him shortly after. He lost everything that he had built. Alara felt a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. The story of her own family's bookstore was a slow, quiet erosion, a tragedy of inches. This was a cataclysm, a grand, sweeping betrayal worthy of a novel. So he comes here every week to, what? Take his revenge on us? She asked, the idea both tragic and monstrous. We think it's about control, Peterson said, his voice tired. He lost control of his entire life, his legacy. So now he controls everything he can. The exact temperature of his sauce, the exact wording of his order. And we let him, because the functions he books, the clients he brings, they pay for this building's property taxes 10 times over. We endure the humiliation. That is the bargain. So I am telling you this as a final warning. From this moment on, you are a machine. Do you understand me? Alara nodded, her mind reeling. The story didn't excuse his cruelty. The story about David's brother made her stomach churn. But it cast it in a new tragic light. He wasn't just a monster. He was a king deposed, raging in his own gilded cage, trying to rebuild a shattered kingdom, one perfectly cooked steak at a time. She left the closet feeling as though she were walking on a wire stretched over a canyon. On one side was her ingrained need for dignity and self-respect. On the other was the clear and present danger of financial ruin for herself, and by extension, for the bookstore that was the last piece of her family. The '96 Screaming Eagle arrived, presented with the reverence due a holy relic. Alara's hands, to her own surprise, were steady as she presented the label. The 1996 Screaming Eagle, sir. He gave a curt nod. She uncorked it with practiced ease, the soft thud echoing in the quiet of the alcove. She poured a small measure for him to taste. He swirled, sniffed, and sipped, his face a mask of concentration. Passable, he declared. She filled his glass and was about to retreat when he spoke again, his voice sharp. Waitress. She stopped, her back to him. Yes, sir. Your name. It was a command. Peterson's words screamed in her mind. You are a function, not a person. Giving him her name felt like handing a sniper her coordinates. It felt like giving him a weapon to use not just against her, but against the people she loved. She took a half second, a tiny eternity, and thought of the faded photograph of her great-grandfather standing proudly in front of his new bookstore. She thought of her grandfather, frail but hopeful, believing she could save it. Her own quiet war for a legacy rose up to meet his loud, angry one. She turned slowly to face him. She would be professional, but she would not be erased. It's Alara, sir, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Alara Vance. Julian Croft stared at her, his expression unreadable. The arctic blue of his eyes seemed to probe for any sign of fear or weakness. He found none. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned his attention back to the skyline, a king returning his gaze to his broken kingdom. As Alara walked away, a profound and terrifying certainty settled over her. She had just broken the cardinal rule. She had given the vulture her name, and now all she could do was wait and see if he would use it to tear her world apart. The following week was a study in suspended animation. Every phone call from an unknown number sent a jolt of ice through Alara's veins. Every official-looking envelope in the bookstore's mail slot made her heart seize, expecting it to be a legal notice, a new and inventive form of ruin orchestrated from a corner booth at Ethelgard's. She researched Croft Holdings, discovering a labyrinthine corporate structure with tentacles reaching into every corner of the city's economy. The story Peterson had told her was true. They could crush a person without leaving fingerprints. When Thursday arrived again, the air in the restaurant was electric with a morbid, shared anticipation. Alara tried to project an aura of calm, but inside she was a knot of anxiety. At precisely 8 p.m., the Bentley materialized at the curb. Jean-Pierre approached Peterson, his face grim. "He is here," Jean-Pierre announced, "and he made a specific request with his reservation." Peterson closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if in prayer. "Don't tell me." "He requested table 12, Jean-Pierre continued, "and the waitress from last week. He asked for Alara Vance by name." A hush fell over the nearby staff. This was no longer a random encounter. It was a summons. He hadn't forgotten. He had focused. The black hole had found its next star to consume. Alara felt her hands grow cold. Peterson walked over, his expression one of weary resignation. "It's you, Vance. He's asking for you. Remember the mission? Machine. No personality, just perfection." Nodding numbly, she smoothed her apron with clammy hands. This felt different. This was not a chance encounter. It was an execution. As she made the long walk to table 12, the usual dining room chatter seemed to fade into a dull roar. Croft was seated, watching her approach. There was no pretense of looking out the window this time. His eyes were locked on her, analytical and intense. "Good evening, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice a marvel of manufactured calm. "Vance," he acknowledged, his tone devoid of any emotion. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit." The request was so far outside the bounds of restaurant protocol that Alara froze. It was a flagrant breach of the server-diner relationship, a deliberate shattering of the established order. She glanced toward Peterson, who was watching from across the room, his face a perfect picture of horror. He gave a frantic, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Sir, I'm afraid I can't. My duties—" "Your duty, right now," Croft interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, commanding timbre, "is to sit down." It was not a request. Choosing the lesser of two imminent disasters, Alara pulled out the heavy chair and sat, perching on the edge, her back ramrod straight. The other patrons began to notice. A low murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Croft ignored them. He pushed a thin, leather-bound book across the table. It was old, the cover embossed with a faded gold leaf title, An Architectural History of Chicago's Foundation. "Page 84, he commanded. Her hands trembling slightly, Alara opened the book. Page 84 detailed the construction of the building they were currently in, the Atherton Building, which housed Ethelgard's on its ground floor. It was built in 1892 by a firm called Thorne and Vance Architectural Works. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Vance. Her great-grandfather wasn't just a bookseller, he was a builder. He had helped design this very building. It was a piece of her history she had never known, a detail lost to time and the family's declining fortunes. "Your family built this place," Croft stated, watching her reaction with unnerving intensity. "And you're working here as a servant. The irony is potent." The word servant was a deliberate sting, but Alara was too stunned by the revelation to feel it. How could he possibly know this? "I did some research after our last encounter," he explained, as if reading her mind. "Your name is not a common one in this city's history. It was easy enough to trace. The Vances were once a name to be reckoned with. Now the last of the line is about to lose a dusty little bookshop." He leaned forward, his arctic eyes pinning her in place. "Tell me, Ms. Vance, how does it feel to be a ghost in your own legacy?" The question was cruel, designed to break her. But instead of shame, a different emotion rose in Alara, a slow, burning anger. He was using her history, her family's struggle, as a tool in his own bizarre psychological game. "My legacy, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice low but shaking with a sudden, fierce pride, "is not in the bricks and mortar that my family built for others. It's in the knowledge and stories we preserve for everyone. That bookstore is not a dusty relic. It is a sanctuary, and I would rather serve people in a building my great-grandfather designed than dismantle legacies for a living, as you do." The words were out before she could stop them. She had just committed the ultimate sin. She hadn't just made eye contact. She hadn't just spoken out of turn. She had passed judgment. She had drawn a sword. The color drained from Peterson's face across the room. Brenda looked like she was about to faint. Julian Croft did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at her, and for the first time the mask of cold indifference cracked. Beneath it she saw a flash of something ancient and raw, a flicker of profound, bottomless pain. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, deliberate movement. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in a smile but in something far more complex. "Order me the steak," he said, his voice a rough whisper, "and bring me the check. And Ms. Vance," he paused, holding her gaze, "bring me the deed to your bookstore tomorrow morning. My office, 9 a.m. sharp." He stood, threw a black American Express card on the table, and walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance, leaving Ilara sitting in a state of pure, unadulterated shock, the ghost of her own history staring back at her from the pages of the open book. She had no idea if she had just been saved or utterly, finally destroyed. Ilara didn't sleep. The night was a long, feverish marathon of pacing the worn floorboards of the bookstore. The smell of old paper, a familiar but uncomforting companion. Was this a trap? Was he going to buy the building just to demolish it in front of her? The ultimate act of psychological cruelty? Or was it something else? Something she couldn't begin to comprehend? Her grandfather, a man whose gentle spirit was ill-suited for the modern world's brutalities, could only offer worried prayers. By dawn, fueled by black coffee and sheer terror, Ilara had made her decision. She would not run. She would walk into the lion's den, not as a lamb, but as a Vance. She put the deed, the foreclosure notice, and a small leather-bound first edition of Carl Sandburg's Chicago Poems into her satchel. If she was going down, she was going down with her history in her hands. Croft Holdings occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, black glass monolith that seemed to suck the light from the sky. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence, manned by a receptionist who looked like she had been sculpted from ice. Ilara, in her simple dark dress, felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a high-security vault. She was led not to a sterile boardroom, but to a vast corner office. One wall was a panoramic window offering a godlike view of the city. The other 3 walls, however, were not lined with awards or stock tickers. They were lined, floor to ceiling, with books. Old books, rare books, books on history, architecture, and art. In the center of the room, on a massive oak table, was not a computer, but a detailed architectural model of a city block. Julian Croft stood by the window, his back to her. "I imagine this is not what you were expecting," he said without turning around. "No, sir," Ilara admitted, her voice quiet. He turned to face her. In the sharp morning light, he looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper. The restaurant's carefully constructed armor of intimidation was gone. Here, in his own space, he just looked weary. "This was my father's office," he said, gesturing to the room. "He collected books. He believed you couldn't build the future without understanding the past. He and your great-grandfather were contemporaries, rivals but respectful ones." He walked over to a shelf and pulled down a heavy, faded blue volume. It was a construction ledger. He opened it to a marked page. "This is the original contract for the Atherton building, signed by Charles Vance and Alistair Croft." Ilara stared at the faded ink, at the 2 signatures from a forgotten era. A history she never knew existed was unfolding before her eyes. "My firm, Croft and Thorne, was supposed to carry on that legacy," he continued, his voice hardening. "We weren't vultures. We were preservationists. We restored old buildings, gave them new life. Marcus Thorne, He saw things differently. He saw history as a liability, a balance sheet entry to be liquidated. He convinced the board that my sentimentality was costing them millions. He used my own vision against me, painted me as a relic, and threw me out of the company I had helped build. He paced the room, the controlled anger of a caged predator radiating from him. For 15 years, I have watched him tear down our city's history. I built Croft Holdings out of the ashes, using their own ruthless tactics against them. I became the monster they accused me of being, because it was the only language they understood. I amassed wealth and power not for its own sake, but for one purpose: to destroy Marcus Thorne and undo the damage he has done. He stopped and looked directly at Alara. I go to Ethelgard's every week because it's in one of the last buildings Thorne hasn't gotten his hands on. I test the staff, I push them, I make impossible demands, because I am looking for something, someone, not a sycophant, not a coward, someone who respects the rules but isn't broken by them, someone with integrity, someone who, when pushed, pushes back not with insolence, but with intelligence. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. And then you walked in. You didn't just push back, Miss Vance. You quoted history. You defended your legacy. In that moment, I wasn't looking at a waitress. I was looking at an ally. He sat down behind his desk and steepled his fingers. Marcus Thorne is planning to buy the Atherton building. He wants to gut it, tear down the facade, and turn it into another glass and steel monstrosity. But there are preservation clauses in the original city. The polished mahogany of the desk felt like a precipice, a boundary line between two worlds. On one side lay her life as it had been, a quiet, desperate battle fought with overdue notices and dwindling hope. On the other was this, an offer so audacious, so utterly consuming, it felt less like a lifeline and more like a conscription into a war she had never known was being waged. It was not a rescue. It was a remaking. He was not offering her a shield, but a sword. Alara's fingers, which had trembled only slightly when she presented the book of poems, were now perfectly still. She watched him, this architect of ruin and preservation, and saw the tectonic plates of his own life shifting behind those Arctic eyes. He had spent 15 years honing his bitterness into a weapon, and now he was offering to share it. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he wasn't just recruiting a historical consultant. He was speaking to the last in a long line of builders, and the dormant blueprints of her own legacy were stirring within her. She slid the Sandberg poems back into her satchel. I will need full access to the city archives, including the pre-fire records, she stated, her voice devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul. It was not the voice of a supplicant. It was the voice of a collaborator. I will also require a budget for document restoration and digital archiving. Your war is with Marcus Thorne. Mine is with time itself. We can fight them both at once. For the first time since she had met him, something other than calculation or cold fury surfaced in Julian Croft's expression. It was a flicker of profound, unguarded respect. The ghost of a smile, sharp and unused, touched his lips. The archives will be yours, Miss Vance, he said, the formality of her name now sounding less like a title and more like an honorific. Burn the budget to the ground if you have to. Just find me the foundation. He stood and extended a hand across the desk. It was not a gesture of condescension, but of compact. His grip was firm, cold, like the steel girders that held up the city. Welcome to the fight. The ensuing weeks were a baptism by fire and parchment. The bookstore, once a hushed sanctuary of fiction, became a nerve center. The air, once thick with the sweet decay of aging paper, now carried the sharp, acidic scent of archival microfilm and the low hum of a high-resolution scanner. Alara moved through this new landscape as if born to it, her quiet intensity transforming into a formidable focus. She was no longer simply saving her great-grandfather's shop. She was inhabiting his purpose. Julian was a tempestuous partner. His years of isolation and command had calcified into habits that grated against her methodical nature. He would demand updates at midnight, his voice a low growl over the phone, impatient with the slow, meticulous work of history. He saw the past as an armory, a collection of weapons waiting to be unearthed. Ilara saw it as a living organism, something to be understood and respected before it could be wielded. Their first major clash came 3 weeks in. Ilara was hunched over a fragile, water-damaged plat map from 1888, painstakingly tracing property lines that no longer existed. Julian paced behind her, a caged tiger in his own office, which had become their de facto secondary headquarters. "Anything?" he demanded for the 10th time that hour. Thorne's lawyers filed another motion to expedite the demolition permits. "We're running out of time." "This map is delicate," Ilara said without looking up, her concentration absolute. "The ink is fading. Rushing this would be like trying to read a ghost by shouting at it." "I don't need a seance, Vance. I need a legal injunction," he snapped, his voice sharp with the old familiar cruelty of Table 12. "Are you a historian or a librarian?" Ilara set down her magnifying glass with a deliberate, resonant click. She turned on her stool to face him, her eyes, usually the color of aged paper, now flashing with the fire of a furnace. "I am the woman you hired to find a needle in a 100-year-old haystack, Mr. Croft. And you are the man who keeps shaking the haystack and demanding to know why I haven't found it yet. Your rage may have built you an empire, but it will not excavate a single fact from this archive." The silence in the office was sudden and absolute, more profound than any in the dining room of Ethelgard's. He stared at her, the vulture of LaSalle Street, momentarily stunned by the small bird that had refused to be devoured. He saw not insubordination, but a fierce, protective ownership of her work, of their work. He saw the builder in her, and it shamed the destroyer in him. He walked to the window, turning his back to her. "My apologies, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "The habits of a long war are difficult to break." "Then we must learn a new way to fight," she replied, her voice softening. "Together." It was in that moment their alliance was truly forged, not in the sterile promise of a contract, but in the messy human collision of their two worlds. From then on, he learned the language of patience, and she learned the art of urgency. He would sit for hours watching in silent fascination as she coaxed stories from brittle paper, and she, in turn, began to understand the complex machinery of finance and law he manipulated with such brutal elegance. The breakthrough came not in a grand, cinematic discovery, but in a quiet, dusty corner of a municipal storage facility. It was a footnote in a city zoning variance ledger from 1922, a time when the Atherton building was being sold by the Vance estate. The entry referenced a charitable trust established by Charles Vance, linked to the deed of the building. It was the thread. Pulling on it, Ilara spent a sleepless, caffeine-fueled week unraveling a tapestry of legal documents, cross-referencing them with her great-grandfather's personal correspondence, which she found tucked away in a mislabeled crate in the bookstore's attic. The covenant was more than Julian had ever dared to hope for. It was an ironclad masterpiece of legal foresight. Charles Vance, a man who had seen Chicago rise from its own ashes, had feared men exactly like Marcus Thorne. The trust he established was not merely about preserving a facade, it was about preserving the character of the street. It gave the trust, whose board was now defunct and its assets long since absorbed by the city, the right of first refusal on any sale and absolute veto power over any structural changes that did not serve the civic and aesthetic harmony of the district. The gun was loaded, but Marcus Thorne was not a man to wait to be shot. Word of their investigation had reached him, and he made his move. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was a quiet, venomous flanking maneuver. One morning, Ilara arrived at the bookstore to find two city inspectors waiting for her. They cited a litany of fictitious violations: inadequate wiring, improper shelving loads, a violation of an obscure historical materials ordinance. The fines were crippling, the timeline for compliance impossible. It was a transparent, bureaucratic assassination attempt. That night, Julian found her slumped over her grandfather's old desk, the violation notices spread before her like a death shroud. For the first time, he saw the full weight of the pressure on her slender shoulders. He saw the 22-year-old girl beneath the formidable historian. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't rage. He simply sat in the worn leather chair opposite her, the silence of the bookstore a comforting blanket around them. "He's trying to break you," Julian said quietly. Because he knows you are the key. He thinks everyone has a price or a breaking point. He might be right, she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and defeat. This is my home. He's using the city my great-grandfather helped build to tear down the last thing he left behind. Julian reached across the desk and gently moved the violation notices aside. He slid a single sheet of paper into their place. It was a corporate registration document for the Vance and Croft Historical Trust. He is wrong, Julian said, his voice imbued with a certainty that was both terrifying and comforting. He has attacked a bookstore, but he has declared war on an institution, our institution. My lawyers are dealing with these inspectors. They will find themselves under investigation for municipal corruption by morning. You, Ms. Vance, need to focus on the real fight. He looked around the dimly lit store, at the silent sentinels of books lining the walls. Your great-grandfather built with stone and steel. You build with truth. Truth is a stronger material. It lasts longer. The final confrontation was set for the Landmarks Preservation Commission's public hearing. Thorne, confident in his political maneuvering, had framed the event as a celebration of his new tower, a formality before the final approval. He had packed the room with his investors, lobbyists, and paid-for supporters, holding slick Progress for Chicago signs. When Julian and Alara entered, a ripple of whispers went through the room. They took their seats not with the investors, but in the front row reserved for public comment, two lone figures against a tide of manufactured consent. Thorne took the podium, a vision of charismatic power. He spoke of jobs, of modernity, of a future unburdened by the sentimentality of the past. He painted the Atherton building as a decaying relic, and Julian Croft as a bitter, obsessed man clinging to a personal vendetta. Let us not allow one man's personal history, Thorne concluded, his voice resonating with false sincerity, to stand in the way of our city's collective future. The room erupted in applause. The commission members smiled, nodding. The outcome seemed preordained. Then Julian was recognized to speak. He walked to the podium, but he did not address the commission. He turned and faced Marcus Thorne. You speak of my personal history, Marcus, Julian began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. You are correct. This is personal. You took my company. You tried to erase my legacy. But you made one critical miscalculation. You assumed that my legacy was the only one you were erasing, he gestured to Alara. This is Alara Vance. Her family built the Atherton building. While you were leveraging futures and liquidating assets, she was in the city archives, rereading our city's past, and she found that the future you are selling is, in fact, a fraudulent commodity. He stepped aside, ceding the floor to her. Alara walked to the podium, a single leather-bound book in her hand. She was no longer a waitress walking into a lion's den. She was a scholar, a protector, and she was about to read the city its own forgotten story. Mr. Thorne speaks of progress, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. But progress without memory is not progress. It is amnesia. My great-grandfather, Charles Vance, did not see this city as a collection of assets on a balance sheet. He saw it as a home. And in the deed for the Atherton building, he embedded its soul. She laid out the details of the covenant in the trust with devastating clinical precision, citing statutes and precedents that made Thorne's high-priced lawyers begin to shift uncomfortably in their seats. She presented the certified documents, the correspondence, the irrefutable proof. But her closing was not about the law. She opened the book she carried, the first edition of Chicago Poems. Carl Sandburg, one of our city's great voices, called Chicago the city of the big shoulders. He wrote of the wrecker who is always there, piling buildings up and pulling buildings down. Mr. Thorne, you are that wrecker. But Sandburg also wrote of the people, the builders, the ones who dream. Charles Vance was a dreamer. He believed a city's skyline should be a conversation between generations, not a monologue by the highest bidder. This covenant is his part of that conversation, and we are here today to ensure his voice is still heard. She closed the book gently. The Vance Trust is not defunct. As the last living heir of its founder, and with the financial backing of my partner, Mr. Croft, I am formally reactivating it. We are exercising our legal right. The sale is void. The demolition is canceled. The conversation, Mr. Thorne, will continue. The silence was deafening. The commission members stared, stunned. Thorne's face was a mask of incandescent fury. His narrative of progress had been shattered and replaced by a more powerful one, a story of legacy, integrity, and a history that refused to die. The foundation of his tower had not just been legally undermined, it had been morally obliterated. Months later, autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk outside Vance & Son booksellers. The old sign had been lovingly restored, and beneath it, in smaller, elegant gold leaf, were the words, "Home of the Vance and Croft Historical Trust." The bookstore was more alive than ever, a bustling hub for students, historians, and citizens, fighting their own battles against the wrecking ball. Thorne's empire, built on a mountain of leveraged debt, had crumbled. The public humiliation of the hearing had caused his investors to flee, triggering a cascade of defaults. Julian, with the surgical precision of the vulture he once was, had orchestrated a hostile takeover. Not to own it, but to dismember it. He sold off the soulless glass towers and toxic assets, using the profits to endow the trust into perpetuity. He had become a wrecker himself, one last time, to clear the ground for something better to grow. Thursday evenings at Ethelgard's had a new ritual. Julian still sat at table 12, but the table was now set for two. Ilara would join him after closing the store, and they would sit for hours, blueprints and research papers spread between them, planning their next preservation project. The fear that once radiated from his corner was gone, replaced by a quiet, creative energy that seemed to warm the entire room. Jean-Pierre would serve them himself, a genuine smile on his face. No longer managing a tyrant, but hosting a founder. One evening, as the city lights began to glitter in the vast window, Ilara looked across the table at Julian. The harsh lines on his face had softened. The Arctic ice in his eyes had thawed, revealing a deep, clear blue. He was no longer a ghost haunting a restaurant. He was a man who had found his way back to the foundations of his own life. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The power? The fear?" He followed her gaze out to the skyline, a tapestry of light and shadow, history and ambition. "I spent 15 years building a fortress of fear around myself," he mused, his voice laced with a weary self-awareness. "I thought it was power. I was wrong. Power isn't making a waiter tremble when you walk into a room. Power is ensuring that 100 years from now, someone will still be able to walk into that room at all." He looked back at her, and a slow, genuine smile, the kind she now saw often, spread across his face. "You did that, Ilara. You didn't just save your legacy. You gave me a reason to rebuild my own." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. A simple gesture of partnership, of shared victory, of a bond forged in dust and ink. Together, they looked out at the city they were saving, one story at a time. The vulture was gone, the waitress had found her voice, and in the quiet heart of Chicago, two builders were once again at work.